The subject today is not like as deeply, well, actually, no, it is actually extremely deeply theological. But what I'm not going to do today is address any of the what we sometimes call, and it's maybe not the best terminology, but the clobber texts, which are the texts intended to show, like, here's the silver bullet that this is wrong. I'm not going to address those today, but I will say, if you have something that's off topic that you want to ask me about, we'll see how long-winded I am, and if there's extra Q&A time after we've talked a little bit about this talk, I would love to answer any other questions on any other text of the Bible that you might have, or just theological musings you have. So we'll just see how long-winded I am. I haven't timed this, so let's see what happens. But I want to talk about a subject that is not just theologically important, but it's also really central to the feelings a lot of us have about this topic, and a lot of the angst a lot of us have, the difficulty, and why it can sometimes be really hard. I think that when we're told that the Holy Spirit is very important for the interpretation of Scripture, I think at least a part of that means that it's the growth that the Spirit brings out in us and in our hearts and our souls, and that some of this conversation and this topic, even in order to be open to the Scriptures, we need the Spirit to do a work on us in our hearts. And that work is essentially the work of love. Like, that is the baseline character of God, as we all know, is love. And so that work is the work of love. But and that's all good and fine and dandy when you're speaking in general terms. But when we're talking about this subject, it gets really complicated really quickly for a lot of us, if not for all of us. The subject of love can be a really hard one even to approach. And a lot of people, when I've talked to them, a lot of people feel, and I know I even felt this back in the day, a lot of people feel like my ability to love the LGBTQ community should not be called into question based on my theological convictions or beliefs. And a lot of people feel attacked, or like they're going to be judged for their theology, and people are going to look down on them, or say that they're not loving, or say that they're not caring, or say that the church is not loving, or the church is not caring. I think this is actually a really huge part of why it's difficult to have these conversations, because of that fear of that judgment, and really that kind of afraid of being shamed. And I want to say that I really can empathize with that. And that's something I've made a lot of effort to try to not do. And I hope I'm good at it. But if I fall short, I'm definitely open to feedback on that, because I think we need to, as much as we can, take shame out of this whole scenario so we can see more clearly as much as possible. But there's been a lot of shame, a lot of insults that have come into play in this, and it's made it really hard. There's just a lot of pain as well, and just a lot of loss, and a lot of hurt relationships, a lot of, I don't know why I can't be close to this person anymore, and all of that. Just really, those are the things, the untold things that we bring into these conversations without really ever talking about it. So I want to acknowledge that up front. And a lot of that builds up in us a sense of like cognitive dissonance, when there's these kind of conflicting and warring things in our mind. And a lot of that conflict, is, I want to be a good, loving Christian. I don't want to hurt people. I don't want to stand and oppose to people who say, I want to love somebody. There's something about that seems off oftentimes, even for people who aren't affirming, or people who hold the accepted views within the church. And at the same time, it's like this very strong desire to love. And I remember feeling like, I care and I love LGBTQ people. And, when I didn't even realize I was part of the community, and when I was, accepting the church's theology and beliefs. And so I remember just feeling like, I do have love and I do have care, and they matter to me. And the thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that, when you are living your life in the authority of Scripture and doing your best to follow God, that ultimately you believe that following God is the best thing for everybody. So you believe that it's the right thing to say, this is wrong and this is something you shouldn't do in your life. It's a basic posture in life of trust in God. So, well, if God says this thing is wrong, then it must also be good for LGBTQ people. And I remember feeling that way and believing that even when I applied it to myself. And at the same time feeling some confusion because I couldn't figure out why it was good. And so I kind of fell back into a posture of, well, I've just got to try to trust and do my best. And I think a lot of people who believe the church's theology are coming from that perspective. And that's really genuinely what they believe. And it's not coming from a place of malice or hate or pain. So I want to read for you a quote by Rick Warren that I think I remember actually reading this quote back in the day and this isn't specifically about LGBTQ, but he doesn't say it is, but I think it is. Anyway, so I remember reading this quote back in the day and thinking, yeah, like I'm okay. Like I don't have to worry about this kind of angst about am I loving the LGBTQ community well? Like, am I going to be judged by them? It just kind of silenced all that and made me feel like, oh, I don't really need to worry about it. Like I'm okay. So I want to read that quote for you right now. And it's in my book as well. Our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. And the second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe or do. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise to be compassionate. And I think that is the point of view that for a lot of people really makes them feel, and definitely at one point in time made me feel like I don't have to worry about whether my theology is loving. Like I can be a loving person. We can have disagreements on this issue and we can still be fine. It doesn't have to impact our relationship. And I know a lot of people believe that, and that there's a lot of sincerity in that belief. So I want to come at it from that direction, but also say that really what I want to do is challenge that belief, because I think there's a couple really important things that statement does and that this approach does. This whole, we can separate our beliefs from the love we have to each other, particularly on this issue. Maybe not every issue, but particularly on this issue, I think is problematic. And I think hopefully over the course of this presentation, you'll come to understand why, and at least, even if you don't agree with me, have some understanding of where people in the LGBTQ community are coming from when they push back against statements like that. So yeah, so first of all, I want to kind of summarize like what he's doing here is he's saying, you have your beliefs over here and you have, the way you feel about people over here. So, you don't have to agree with somebody. You don't have to agree with their lifestyle, or you don't have to support them. You can disagree with what they're doing in their life, but still care about them and still be compassionate. He doesn't use the word love, but I'm going to use the word love. It's kind of like love the sin or hate the sin, right? And it is very sincere, but I think, and we're going to expand upon this and show this more and more, but I think what is essentially wrong with this approach is that it takes the idea of your beliefs, or your theology, or however you want to say it, your convictions, your sincerely held religious theological beliefs and convictions, particularly around moral issues. It takes those over here, and then it takes the quality of your relationships and the love and the compassion and the care that you have for people, and it puts it over here. And it keeps those two things completely and entirely separate. Now, sometimes that's fine, obviously. It's absolutely and totally fine if you, for some reason, have that disability that prevents you from enjoying pineapple on pizza. You know, like, I'm sorry that you're not able to enjoy pineapple on your pizza. And we can disagree about that. And I think that you're wrong. I think pineapple is wonderful on pizza, and that's going to impact the relationship of our lives. The quality of the relationship that we have between one another, exactly zero. So that's really trivial, right? There are other beliefs that maybe do impact relationships more. A lot of people are struggling with different political ideologies right now, you know, left and right and things like that. And really having different convictions about the direction the country is going and the impact that has on people. Any country. I know everybody here is not from America, and I know that this is a global phenomenon at this point. So, you know, a lot of people have struggles with those things, and that can be a challenge, and often that challenge can be overcome, maybe not 100% of the time. And then there are some beliefs that are really about kind of the core of who somebody is or how someone functions and works in the world. And a lot of beliefs in this category are really beliefs about, you know, what you should do based on your gender, your ethnicity, or something like that. So, for example, for most of the time, actually, most people sincerely held the beliefs that education was wasted on women. And I like education and I like learning. And some people still hold that viewpoint. Were I in a relationship with somebody who held that viewpoint, that would be very difficult for me, particularly if it was a family member. You know, let's say, for example, that I grew up with a father who, instead of telling me from the time I was a child that I would definitely be going to college and that was not optional. Actually, he didn't even say that. He didn't even need to. It was just the assumption that, of course, I would go to college. But, you know, let's say that instead I'd grown up with a father who believed that, you know, my brother should go get educated, but I shouldn't because it would have been wasted on me. Is that going to impact the quality of my relationship with him? You know, if he kind of stands in the way and opposes things that are good and healthy for me? And what if I decide to go ahead and get an education? And what if it's challenging? And how do I talk about him with that? Now, maybe I could maintain a relationship with him. That's entirely possible. But in maintaining that relationship with him, would the quality of that relationship with him be impacted by his beliefs? Absolutely. There's no way to avoid that. Of course, the quality of our relationship would be impacted by the beliefs that he has. There's really no way around it. And so it doesn't only matter whether our beliefs are sincere. It doesn't only matter what the intention we have to love. It doesn't matter if we really, really care about love. I mean, it does matter, but it doesn't just solve all the problems. If we really genuinely want to love, it doesn't mean all the problems go away. It also matters what the content of our beliefs and theology is, because beliefs and theology is not an esoteric mind game that we play. Beliefs and theology says something about who God is and who we are and who we're supposed to be in the world. These things are extremely important. And there's a theological reason for this as well. This isn't just, you know, kind of my ideas or examples. Really, when we look at, excuse me, getting over a cold. Really, when we look in the scriptures at really what matters when it comes to what is the most important part of the law and the scriptures, Jesus tells it fairly clearly in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. This is like the central moral statement of the Bible. It says the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to them. And Jesus said to him, and here it is, this is the meat of it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And now here's the part that Jesus adds in, and he says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So if you think of, an anchor point on a wall or something, an anchor point, that's that really strong, solid point. And hanging from that anchor point, you have what? All the law and the prophets, which is to say all of Scripture. The only reason why all of the law and the prophets, all of Scripture, all the teachings of the Bible, all the morals and the ethics and everything doesn't fall to the ground and shattered is because it is hanging on that anchor point of loving God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. That is the anchor point that all of our beliefs should be grounded in. It's the foundation. So, Jesus, this is what Jesus is teaching us. And this is especially true when it comes to moral beliefs, beliefs about how we should live in the world. You cannot separate your relationships and the quality of your relationships from the things you believe. Therefore, it turns out that the idea that any of us shouldn't be judged because of our beliefs is actually wishful thinking. It definitely would have been an easy way for us to have an out for the discomfort that we feel around these subjects, and that discomfort is real and it's difficult. And it would have been really nice to have an easy out from that discomfort. But in fact, the Bible actually teaches us that our beliefs should flow from love, which must inevitably mean that our beliefs will impact the quality of our love and our ability to love those around us. And specifically, when speaking about the LGBTQ community, our beliefs and our theology will inevitably impact the love that we have and the love that we may or may not show for this particular community. So there's really no way out of that reality. So what I'd like to talk about now that hopefully I've made my case, hopefully I've made my case on that as a setup, is 3 specific particular beliefs that I have encountered that I believe are causing a lot of difficulty, and that have caused a lot of difficulty and harm in my own life. And so I want to talk about 3 particular beliefs, and some of these, I hope this can be helpful for you, even if you really don't see a different way to see things right now, besides what the church teaches, besides the accepted viewpoint in the church. I hope you'll read my book, and I hope you'll continue to engage in that question. But even if you're not there yet, I think this might be a useful discussion for you, because not all of these beliefs are necessarily tied to believing that same-sex marriage and transgender identity is wrong. Like, there's a lot of things that the church can do to move in the right direction, even without getting to that point, which I believe we should get to that point, but there's other things along the way that we can do. So one of the really harmful beliefs that I've encountered is the idea that there is a gay lifestyle, like the one gay lifestyle, or the homosexual lifestyle. I don't use the word homosexual a lot. I think it's somewhat derogatory, but some folks do. So I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to give you a little setup. So just trust me that I'm going to get there. Before I went to the seminary at Andrews University, I was a substance abuse counselor. I worked with teenagers in intensive outpatient care and community mental health. I don't know if anyone's familiar with community mental health, but it can be very gritty. It's like right there in the real life, like suffering and challenges that people have. And I was working with teenagers, 18 and under, who had really, some of them, extremely serious substance abuse problems. There's a lot of methamphetamine going around here in Phoenix. I'm not even on the game now, so I don't know how prevalent it is now, but a lot of methamphetamine, a lot of heroin. And I was working with these clients and just like really concerned about them and trying to help them and support them in their lives. Just trying to live my Christianity well and maintaining my prayer life, my connection with God, all those things, and in this kind of real world setting, and the suffering and the difficulties that people had in the world. And I just remember it was very, very stark because, I was working to the last possible moment because I wanted that paycheck, and working to the last possible moment. And then I just packed up my car and I drove across country from Phoenix, Arizona to Berrien Springs, Michigan, and found myself just a couple of days later sitting in the seminary chapel for the first time as we had our orientation. And I'll never forget that feeling I had. I didn't even have words for it yet, but it was so stark. It was going from these kind of somewhat grungy offices and these just real deep challenges, and literally worrying about people and whether they were going to live or die because of their addictions. And then I find myself in this. I don't know if you've been to the seminary chapel. It's so beautiful. I just love it. It's got this light, beautiful stone, and these huge windows with light pouring in, and of course the big organ. It's just very bright. It's very open. It's very clean looking and very, very nice. Very, very nice. Clearly like a jewel of the church. And I remember sitting there in the pews and watching, these professors and administrators who I was just getting to know, and their nice clothes. Everybody just looked so nice. Everybody was just so friendly. Everyone was so kind. We prayed before we did anything at all. And it was just this really clean, kind, warm, beautiful environment. And nobody seemed to have any problems. And I was just it was disorienting for me, honestly, to go from in the thick of it with people who are struggling with drug problems, like serious, potentially life-ending problems, and with, therapists and coworkers who are just like raw and real in their lives, and just the mess of it all, to just this serene place where everyone was praying and worshiping God, and everything was beautiful and everything was bright. And it was like really hard for me. It was hard for me to adjust for a while. And I remember some of my classmates actually complaining that the seminary didn't do enough to foster our spiritual lives, and thinking like, well, isn't that our responsibility? Like, why would we expect the seminary to do that for us? It was just such a strange thing. Like, it was just such a strange thing to me to have this really different culture of everything. We've got everything together, and everything needs to be as spiritual as possible, and we're going to pray all the time, and we're dressed well, and everything's clean, and from the drug life. Well, it was really difficult because it was during my first year at the seminary. It took me a while to figure out my orientation. I would never have talked about it that way then, but it took me a while to realize, though it's painfully, humorously obvious in hindsight, that I'm attracted to women. And it was actually, I'm biased. I'm also attracted to men, and so it never really occurred to me that was even something that was possible. Any time that maybe I'd be getting some weird feelings, I would just like dismiss them so quickly, because I was a good, Christian girl. Like, I was attracted. I'm obviously not gay. Like, it was just something that was not within the realm of possibility. And it's very difficult to see something when you think it's actually impossible that something exists. And so it wasn't actually until my first year at seminary, a very difficult timing, that I realized the feelings that I was having. And it was very isolating and very painful. You know, here I am kind of in this beautiful setting where everyone is spiritual, everyone has their act together, and everyone is definitely heterosexual. I think there's been some people who have been out at the seminary who are friends of mine now since more recently, but at the time, certainly no one was. I'm sure I'm not the only one though. Anyway, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was there. So I started to look for signals to see, you know, whether I would be welcome. And actually, I kind of knew from the beginning that I wasn't. It didn't feel safe. But I started to look for signals about, you know, how people there really felt about me or thought about me. And I remember sitting in that same chapel one day, and someone was talking, and I don't remember what the sermon was about. I remember nothing except that they were talking about Genesis 19, the story of Sodom. And they just, as they were describing it in their own words, they said that there was a gang of homosexual men who came to rape the visitors. I remember just sitting there like, what did she just say? Like, it was the most bizarre thing to me. Like, the image that she's getting is like that, like homosexual men just kind of get in these gangs and they roam around looking for people to rape, like looking for presumably straight men to rape or something. I don't know, or just people, they look for men to rape. And like that's like a pastime of gay people. I don't know. It was the wildest thing. And it was, I mean, you would never talk about like a gang of like heterosexuals, like, you know, and it was just like, it was the wildest thing. And I just remember thinking like, does she think that that's what gay people are like? And is that like, what's going on here? And I remember looking around to see, like, kind of surreptitiously looking to my sides to see, is somebody else, did that catch anyone else off guard? Does anyone else have a problem with this? Like, nobody seemed to be reacting at all. There is just no reaction at all. There were other times, you know, when it would come up, not very often, but when it would come up, you know, the story was pretty much the same. They're usually talking about male homosexuals, and they usually described people who just were out of control sexually, people who felt terrible about themselves, who were deeply unhappy, who used drugs, sometimes people who were violent. And that was always the story. And sometimes it was also that the person would return to Jesus later in life, and things like that. They talk about people dying of AIDS. That was always the story. It was only one story, and that was the gay lifestyle. That was the homosexual lifestyle that was being described. And I think that term is that picture and image is still evoked when people use the word homosexual lifestyle, whether they intend to or not. That is quite often exactly what's meant by it, and that's definitely what's evoked when someone talks about the gay lifestyle or the homosexual lifestyle. So I was getting one story about what these folks were like, and that story was that these people are deeply broken. Not in the universal sense in which we all need Jesus, but that these people were horribly, awfully broken. These people are nothing like us, and it's a real shame. And shame is exactly what I began to feel. It really started to impact me. I mean, obviously none of those behaviors had anything to do with me, and yet knowing that if I was open about what was happening on the inside with me, I was so likely to encounter those kind of stereotypes, because that's just what people saw. That's what people understood. And I just really began to feel shame. And it's interesting, shame is not a primary emotion, you know, like sad, mad, glad, afraid. Those are kind of primary emotions. Shame is a secondary emotion that we learn to experience in community. We learn to experience shame when we experience community, and when we see people who are told by their community, you're not good enough to be here, you're not like us. And shame is a feeling of intense brokenness, and feeling that we're not good enough to belong, and we're not what this group is. Okay, we're just who we are, and our being is not okay. And it comes with just depression, isolation, loneliness, fear, anxiety. It comes with all those things. I recently heard a psychologist say it's the most painful of all emotions. it's incredibly hard and isolating and difficult. And that's what the impact is on LGBTQ people when our Adventist communities talk about the gay lifestyle or the homosexual lifestyle and present one story of what it means, and never speak of LGBTQ people in a way that is honoring and loving and respectful. And when there's no place in our community for a person to be honest about who they are and also be accepted and respected. When there's no examples, there's no seminary teachers who are part of the community or who talk about having any of these feelings. There's no leaders, active leaders in the community, people who are just respected just in their own right for who they are. When that doesn't exist, and the only story that exists is this gay and homosexual lifestyle story, it inevitably creates shame. And that's exactly what I experienced. And the thing that I only realized later is as people spoke about this one story, about these people who are broken, it eventually resulted in me actually feeling broken. And it was incredibly difficult. And so I want to, I'm just going to leave you there because it did get much better for me. And I actually told this story recently, and I talked about how it got much better and God brought healing. But for now, what I want to really ask is this belief that there is a gay lifestyle or a homosexual lifestyle? Is this a belief that comes from the source of, is love the source of this belief? Is love for the LGBTQ community the source of this belief? If it's not good enough for Jesus, because all the law and the prophets hang on this idea of love for God and love for our neighbor. So if the source of this belief is not love for LGBTQ people, then this belief is no good. It's certainly not something that shows up in the Bible. And it's certainly something that impacts people. So can you hold this belief that there's a gay lifestyle and that this is what it is, and that being this type of person is going to lead you in this direction? It's going to lead you away from God. It's going to lead to a life of sadness and bitterness and brokenness. This belief, is it possible to hold this belief and still love LGBTQ people? I would say to that your love has to be in spite of this belief. It has to conquer an overwhelming weight of the ways in which this belief are harmful and absolutely opposed and antithetical to love. So I want to look at another belief. That's number one. We're doing more. Number two. This one's probably not as depressing as the last one. Number two. So this one is usually not stated directly. It's usually stated indirectly in 1,000 million different ways. It's a belief that lies in the background of people's minds and in the background of how they approach this question and this entire discussion. That's part of why I named my book title the way I did, actually, is to undermine this belief. But this belief is that you can either be Seventh-day Adventist or LGBTQ. Pick one. You can't be both. So you're either Adventist or you're LGBTQ. And if you decide to be LGBTQ, well, just move on. Just move on. You picked your side. Just leave us alone and just move on and go live your life and do your thing. And you're not really part of us anymore. And I see this show up many, many, many times in many, many, many ways. And I mean, it's not true. There are, of course, Adventists or LGBTQ. Although a lot end up leaving the church for understandable reasons. But this really manifested itself in my life in that when I came out, I was instantly perceived differently by a lot of people. They instantly started talking about me differently than they ever had before. I was an Adventist pastor, gone to seminary, like there's nothing, I changed my beliefs on this thing. I changed my convictions, and I was just like I was honest about my internal life. And suddenly I was just like in a completely different category. I wasn't part of them anymore. I absolutely did not belong anymore. And so
you're not showing any videos of us.
I remember one pastor particularly, I was talking to him, and he was somebody who really vocally challenged the church a lot to be more loving to LGBTQ people. And I'd said something that he'd really disagreed with. I think actually related to this same topic, that I didn't believe that a church could be entirely loving without also being fully affirming, which I believe. And he just really was upset that I believed this. And so I said, well, let's just talk. So we talked, and I remember him talking to me, and I know that he believed that this was loving and compassionate. And here's what he said. He said, you remember, he said, I take this for my model. I take the story of Zacchaeus in the Bible as my model. So Zacchaeus, was this tax collector, and he was a sinner and did these awful things, but Jesus was still loving and caring to him. And he invited him over to his home, and he showed him compassion. And I think for a lot of Adventists, because they have this either Adventist or LGBTQ thing in their mind, and as soon as you're in the LGBTQ category, you're kind of like at a lower level. Because a lot of Adventists kind of have this mentality, that sounds really good to them. But it was honestly jarring to me because I still wasn't used to it yet. I was still used to being treated the way I always had before, with the same level of respect I had before. And no one ever would have compared themselves to Jesus and me to Zacchaeus before I came out. Absolutely not. Never. It would have been quite insulting. But in this context, it actually, rather than being insulting, it felt to him compassionate. And I think sometimes if we can pay attention to the things that we think that we're saying and doing that feel to us compassionate, and whether or not those things would feel compassionate if those same things were done or said to another group of people, that tells us a lot about our underlying assumptions that might be unstated, but are nonetheless very much there. I had another experience recently, and now I don't get upset by these things so much, but it was still jarring. One of my friends who's a pastor, fairly well known in the church. Actually, I shouldn't call him a friend anymore, but an acquaintance. And he said, when I came out, part of my coming out video, I talked about how hard it was going to be for me to go from being an insider to being an outsider in the Adventist church. And, it was just a lot about, this was my place where I had belonging, and I had a place in this community, and that was no longer going to be the case shortly. And it was very difficult for me. And he responded to my video by saying, "You'll always be an insider to me." So saying this isn't going to change the way that I think about you. So he's explicitly rejecting, and he's saying, I don't believe in this either SDA or LGBTQ thing. Like, I don't believe it. You're always going to be an insider to me. This isn't going to impact that. And that's kind of where we started. And we've had various, disagreements on social media, where I think both of us have tried to be pretty respectful towards each other, but also honest about our disagreements. But I don't think it's ever come to a point of insults or anything like that. It's so common on social media. But I've just always been honest kind of about what I believe. And I found out recently, a friend sent me a screenshot of the Adventist, I shouldn't say what it is, about a Facebook group that I was kicked out of, that's for Adventist pastors, that has thousands and thousands of Adventist pastors in it. And he posted on there for thousands of pastors to read about me, saying that he believes I've fallen into sin and I should not be given an audience. And it was just so jarring to me, the difference between "you'll always be an insider to me" to "I've fallen into sin and I shouldn't be giving an audience." The thing is, nothing's really changed, from when I came out to now. Like, I don't know what it would have been that I did that made him believe that, other than that I believe differently than him on this particular theological concept. But yeah, I think, he started off trying to bring the two together, but ended up, in a very different place. So oftentimes this belief actually gets kind of intertwined with the homosexual lifestyle belief, because you start to think, oh, they're not SDA, they're LGBTQ, and LGBTQ people have this homosexual lifestyle, so they're that person, so they're that type of person, they fall into sin. So it kind of does make sense that over time, he had good intentions, but over time they kind of broke down. So yeah, I think oftentimes this belief actually also functions. I think it's important to think about how beliefs function and how they protect us. And I think this belief often functions to kind of protect Adventists from the feeling that LGBTQ people are a part of us. Like, we don't have to deal with the problems that our lives and our ideas inevitably present to the church. It's just like, move on and leave us alone. Like, just move on. This is what Adventists are. This is not what you are. So just move on and leave. Unfortunately, that's very different than the way we talk about Adventism in any other context. And that it's, if you're convicted of it, if you believe it, if it's your community, if you grow up in it, it's just so deeply immersed in it as I was, and as many of us are. Yeah, that's just not the way we speak about the church in any other context. Just leave it there. What is the other place to go? There's actually not one. I think it's more of a desire to just not have to deal with our presence, because it's very uncomfortable when we stick around. So again, I return to that question: is this belief, that you can either be SDA or LGBTQ, is this belief a belief that's rooted and grounded in love? Is love the source of this belief? Or would love call us to a different belief? Would love call us to say, yeah, there are LGBTQ Adventists, which is part of why I titled my book, The Bible and LGBTQ Adventists, as a challenge to this kind of subtle belief. Okay, as not super expected, it's not super surprisingly, I am looking at the clock now and realizing what time it is, so I'm going to skip my third one. This third one is actually a whole chapter in my book. Actually, some of the other stuff in this are chapters in my book too, so I won't go into too much detail with it. We'll just hit it really quick. But the third belief is the most challenging, the most difficult for people to accept, that this belief in this theology could actually really be harmful. And then that is the theology itself, that marriage should only be heterosexual, and also that it's not legitimate to be a transgender person. These two beliefs, this is the heart of it. These are the really beliefs, these are the beliefs that really all the other ones really flow from. If this one kind of wasn't there, the other beliefs wouldn't be there either. So this belief, I really don't know if there is a way around this. I don't know what that way around this would be. But if marriage is inherently heterosexual, then it seems to me inevitable that heterosexual people are inevitably superior to people who aren't heterosexual. That heterosexual marriages are inevitably superior to same-sex marriages, and that people who are cisgender are inevitably superior to people who are transgender, because there is sin inherent in our ways of living, our ways of building family, our ways of existing in the world as gendered people, and our ways of just even experiencing our own desire for love and care. Those ways inevitably, even if let's say, even if you're gay and you say, I believe the church's teachings and so I'm celibate, I don't see a way around seeing that as still being like, oh, wouldn't it be great, like if you were heterosexual, then you would not have this desire for sin? And yes, heterosexual people have sinful desires too around their sexuality, but at its base, it's a desire for something that we recognize as good. But if you're gay at its base, maybe it's not. And if you're heterosexual and you decide that God has called you to celibacy, which is definitely not in vogue these days. Marriage is way emphasized in our culture, but historically it's been common that if a straight heterosexual person would believe that God had called them to celibacy, their answering of that call would be an affirmation of the goodness of their sexuality. That I'm giving up this good desire that I have, this desire for a spouse, because I found this higher good. But for a person who's exclusively attracted to the same sex, that commitment to celibacy is a different thing. I'm giving up this bad, sinful thing because I can't have it because it's wrong, and living the only life that's left to me, which is a celibate life. And I try to do that, in honor of God. Yes, it's a sacrifice for God, and yes, it can be a spiritual thing and a calling. But the reason for it is so different that it inevitably is not an affirmation of sexuality, but a rejection of something really innate in who they are and the desire that they have for love. So, and actually very, very few people, just if you look at the reality of it, very, very, very few gay people have been able to pull off lifelong celibacy in response to being gay and believing in the church's accepted theology. Even people who begin with the best intentions, some of it is because people just become differently convicted theologically when they really start studying the scripture and the Bible. But it's simply something that doesn't happen very often. But it does happen sometimes. And I actually think, and I developed this idea pretty thoroughly in my book, but I think there's some real strong parallels here between what we find in the book of Acts and culminating in Acts chapter 15 of the acceptance of the Gentile Christians into the church. Now, there's differences. Theologically, these are two very different subjects. Whether or not Gentiles need to be circumcised is a very different question than whether or not gay people need to be celibate. It's a very different question in terms of the text that you turn to, but there's some important parallels too. So some of the parallels that are really important. So, we talk about that the question was including Gentiles into the church. That actually wasn't the question. There were already Gentiles in the church who had voluntarily circumcised themselves in order to be part of the church. So there were Gentiles in the church already. They had to give up a lot of their Gentile identity in order to be part of the church. And they had to really act and look more Jewish in order to do that. But they were allowed to do it, but very, very, very few ever actually did it, even though a lot more were actually interested in doing it, or interested in being part of the church, or part of Judaism. Very few actually took that step. Again, similar to the LGBTQ community. And so you could have pointed to, if you're an early Christian, you could have said, look, here's some Jews who are doing it. It works. Or here's some Gentiles who are getting circumcised. Like, why wouldn't you get circumcised for Jesus? Jesus asks us to die for him. Why would circumcision not be a big enough sacrifice? Why would that be too small a sacrifice? And yet the church actually decided that it was too big, heavy of a burden, as we'll talk about in a moment. There's a crying baby. I don't know if you can hear it. I'm at my brother's house. Anyway, yeah. So that's part of what happened. Part of the question, and also with the LGBTQ community, it's not technically a question of whether or not we can be in the church. It's a question of whether we can be in the church and participate in this behavior. For the Gentiles, it was circumcision, and for us, it's marrying a person we are attracted to, or being the gender that we know are in an internal sense. For transgender people, that they have an internal, persistent sense of gender identity that that they want to live out in congruence and authenticity. So these behaviors, both for the Gentiles and for our community, they're very central to who we are as human beings, very much about our identity. Actually, more so for the LGBTQ community, I would say, than for Gentiles. More unchangeable for us, I would say. You can't voluntarily change your sexual orientation or your internal sense of gender. Yeah, so there's these parallels, but what really is striking to me, and I'll just jump ahead. I'll not do all the details, but what's really striking to me is if you actually read Acts 15 and how the church responded. It's like we have this question and we're going to meet and we're going to gather and we're going to answer and we're going to ask this question. What do we do about these Gentiles? They're uncircumcised and they're being baptized and they're showing fruits of the Holy Spirit. And Paul and Silas come and they share their stories. And I'll never stop being impressed by this because it almost seems so rare, but it just says that they listened to their stories. So they just sat there and they listened as they told all of these stories about these people they had encountered. They told all these stories about these uncircumcised Gentiles, these unclean people who they believed were defiled and not sons of Abraham and not good enough to be children of God, and that God's people had taught this for thousands of years. This is a widely accepted theological position for a very, very long time. And so they listened, they told these stories, and then Peter had this dream. I'm going to assume you're familiar with it, of the unclean things and God saying what's clean. What I have not called unclean, don't call unclean, and going and meeting with Cornelius. And Cornelius, this Gentile, receiving the Spirit before he was circumcised. And Peter told this story. And the thing that amazes me about this is that they came and they listened to these stories. They gave one verse about how it says that the Gentiles will praise his name in the Old Testament or something like that. The Gentiles, that the Gentiles will be part of the people of God. They didn't take that to mean the Gentiles will become circumcised and be part of the people of God. They certainly could have, because wouldn't that have been obvious? But they didn't actually do theology at this point. It's actually really shocking and surprising to me because it's so different from the way we function now. But they didn't actually do theology at this point. They paid attention to what God was doing. They really listened to what these Gentiles were like. And they had a lot of inborn prejudice, but they allowed themselves to overcome it. And they actually just decided that, well, if these people clearly are following God with their lives and they're not circumcised, then why are we going to make them be circumcised? And Peter says that why are we going to put this burden on them? Which I think is referencing what Jesus talked about his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And it's kind of shocking to me, actually, that they kind of made this decision against thousands of years of theology and some really good theological arguments. I mean, Paul hadn't articulated his theology yet. The books of Galatians and Romans weren't there. That all came later. What came first was this just really simple acceptance of these individuals. And I think that should be a challenge to the church today. Yeah, and again, I articulate it a lot more clearly in the book. But I want to close with one more little quick story, and then we can have time for some questions. I think I'm going to have to get some more water as well. I stole this illustration, as pastors are prone to do. I stole this illustration and reused it one time. And I was giving a worship talk to a middle school group at an Adventist school. And I wanted to talk to them about faith and belief. And so I asked for their most skeptical soul, somebody who was not easily drawn in and someone who was not going to be conned. And they volunteered, this kid, and he came up and put a blindfold on him and said, I put a blindfold on him and put a chair behind him that he couldn't see. He didn't know it was there. And I said, okay, you're not allowed to wiggle. You're not allowed to squat and try to feel around. But I'm telling you, there's a chair behind you. If you just fall back you'll fall back into the chair and you'll sit down. Would you like to sit in the chair? And you could see how tormented he was and how difficult it was for him. And long story short, he was very uncomfortable and did not sit in the chair, and he sat back down. So then I asked for two of like the best buds on campus, like two like really good friends, and they came up and did the same thing. And I had the friend tell the other friend that the chair was behind him, and he was blindfolded. And the one who was blindfolded, this couldn't have worked out better. He literally just like threw his whole body back into the chair. He just launched himself into the chair and just like landed solidly on the chair, like absolute total trust and faith in his friend. Because of that trust and faith, he believed with certainty that the chair was there. And that's to say that the things that we believe inevitably are going to impact the way that we behave. If you believe his chair is behind you, then you're going to sit. And if you don't, then you're not. And the things that we believe about LGBTQ people, about marriage, it's inevitably, it's going to impact the way that we move and live in the world. It's going to impact, for some people, the way that they want to deal with politics and some of the things we have on some of these bans that are happening and these really awful things that are happening to the trans community in this country. Those are stemming from beliefs that people have about who trans people are and who LGBTQ people are. And they're only acting on the things that they believe. That's what they're doing. And so the beliefs that people have are inevitably linked to the things that people do. They can't be separated, and they shouldn't be separated. And as Christians, we need to remember what Jesus taught us about our beliefs. And what Jesus taught us is that our beliefs should be grounded and rooted, and they should come on and depend entirely on love. And if they're not, it's going to impact our ability to love inevitably. So that's what I have for you.